All right, please go ahead and take your seats. We're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. On behalf of the School of Public Health here at Georgia State University, I'm really delighted to welcome you to the School of Public Health Grand Rounds lecture series. This is our second year of the lecture series, which is organized by Jelaine Arias, Associate Professor, and the Grand Rounds Planning Committee. The purpose of this series is to engage nationally recognized thought leaders in dialogue that contribute to our school's mission and to advance health equity and to foster solutions to contemporary and emerging health issues locally and globally. Today we're honored to host our first School of Public Health alumnus as our featured speaker. Dr. Nataki Osborne Jelks earned her PhD from the Georgia State University School of Public Health and now serves as assistant professor in the Environmental and Health Sciences program at Spelman College. She's a nationally recognized leader in engaging urban communities and youth of color in environmental stewardship. And we're really delighted to welcome her back to SPH to share her expertise with us today. Thanks for being here. While I did not work with Dr. Osborne Jelks myself when she was a student here, I have watched her achievements from afar since she graduated, and I'm immensely proud of everything that she has accomplished. At this time, I'd like to invite to the stage someone who did work with Dr. Osborne Jelks, serving as her doctoral research advisor and committee chair, Dr. Christine Stauber, Associate Professor in Environmental Health here in the School of Public Health, and Associate Chair of the Department of Population Health Sciences. At this time, I'd like to invite Christine to the stage to introduce our speaker.
These are new for me, so I have to work on how I look at people. This is really a new challenge that comes with this. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted to have Nataki back at the School of Public Health. And just to remember, along with the people that were here in 2011 when we started our PhD program, Nataki was one of the first students in our PhD program. But I want to share some really interesting and exciting details about what Nataki did before she came to Georgia State and what she's done since. As you heard, she's an assistant professor in environmental and health sciences at Spelman College, and her work investigates urban environmental health disparities, the role that place, race, and social factors play in influencing health, cumulative environmental risks in health, the impact of climate change on vulnerable populations, and the connection between urban watersheds, pollution, the built environment, and health. She also develops, implements, and evaluates community-based initiatives that set conditions to enable low-income and communities of color to empower themselves to reduce exposure to environmental health hazards and improve health and quality of life. Among her other many important roles, Dr. Jelks co-founded the West Atlanta Watershed Alliance, which is a community-based environmental justice organization that works to grow a cleaner, greener, healthier, more sustainable West Atlanta through authentic community engagement, organizing, education, community science, and participatory research. And certainly it has played a pivotal role in the work that she does, and she'll talk about today. I'd also like to mention that we're not the only university in the city that she is an alum of. She studied chemistry and civil and environmental engineering at Spelman and the Georgia Institute of Technology, respectively, before earning a master's of environmental and occupational health degree at Emory University. And as I was so lucky to have and work with Dr. Jelks during her PhD here, she's gone on to many exciting things, both during and after, including being named an Ecological Society of America Excellence in Ecology Scholar, and she was selected to receive one of 6 national winners of Rachel's Network Catalyst Award for Women of Color environmental leaders. And in 2022, she was selected as a Harvard University Fellow under the JPB Foundation as an environmental health scholar. So with all of these accomplishments, I'm so delighted to have you back and that we can, say that, you get to share your brilliance with us again. So thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to your talk. Please welcome Dr. Jelks to the stage.
you so much, Dr. Lynn, and to Dr. Stauber. She always says, call me Christine, but I can, I just still call her Dr. Stauber. I call everybody, by the name that I met them as. So it's really an honor to be back here. And oh my goodness, I see one of my former students, Arica Holt, who was a high school student who I worked with many years ago doing some of this work in the community. So this is exciting to see and just to be here. Just a pleasure to be back. Thank you so much for the hospitality that has been displayed and kind of rolled out today. Always excited to be back at one of my alma maters. So I'll start just kind of giving a little bit more of a personal introduction in terms of some context about how I got started in work around environmental justice. I'll talk a little bit about Atlanta as a site for the study of environmental health disparities research. Give us a quick little orientation to community engaged research. I do a lot of work that is very place-based and participatory in nature. Working collaboratively with community residents. I want to talk about what that can look like, and then share a few examples, and then kind of close out and see if there are any questions. This won't be typical. I don't have a lot of literature to cite, don't have a lot of statistics to cite either, but I'm going to try to tell a few stories through utilizing data and talking about the approaches that community-based organizations and researchers are engaging in to try to address problems that we see and experience at the grassroots community level. So in terms of my personal introduction, while I went to Spelman College and Georgia Tech for my undergraduate studies, I'm a daughter of the South. Originally, I was born in Mississippi, but I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. For a while, and really that time in Baton Rouge really heavily influenced the work that I do today. There were just a lot of things that I noticed anecdotally about Baton Rouge and really about the South. And so this is 2023, this is the 50th anniversary of hip hop. And so to bring hip hop together with Atlanta, I'll mention that there is a group, I don't think they're, I don't know, but I don't think they're really actively working together right now, but there was a hip hop group called Goody Mob, and they had this song in the 1990s called The Dirty South. They were talking, there were a lot of political undertones to that song, talking about kind of the war on drugs, and Atlanta has this storied history with this, like the Red Dog Unit, and these are probably things, if you're not from here, you haven't heard of them, but there was this, unit of the police force that was really hard on, kind of seeking out those who were involved in drug trafficking and that sort of thing. And so this song kind of brought about a lot of ideas around how there were disparities, in communities in terms of, who might have been using illicit drugs and what types of illicit drugs were being used and how people were being penalized based on whether this was happening in black communities or white communities, et cetera. And so while that song is it wasn't about the environment per se, many people in the environmental justice movement sort of adopted that moniker, the Dirty South, to talk about what has happened across the South and Southeast in terms of the number of communities who are disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards, by pollution-generating facilities, et cetera. And so Dr. Robert Bullard, who was one of my mentors as an undergraduate student, said that the South has a legacy of unequal protection. Why would the environment be any different? He's an environmental sociologist, so he's talking not just about environmental issues, but about, the attack on voting rights. We could, talk about, the lack of interest in Medicaid expansion. When we talk about, what we've seen happen in terms of federal resources that have been allocated to address issues of health disparities, but, how in the South, some of the Southern governors have not, been on board with that. So basically, when he said this, I thought, well, the environment isn't any different, especially when we think about, again, what people call the belly of the beast is kind of the south and southeast in terms of, where communities of color are proximally located, next to a lot of pollution generating facilities. So I mentioned Louisiana and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where I grew up. And so Baton Rouge is a part of the Cancer Alley Corridor, this 85-mile stretch between Baton Rouge and New Orleans that houses over 135 or so chemical companies, petrochemical companies, and other pollution generating facilities. And so I made a lot of observations while I lived there. Again, wasn't born there, but my family was transplanted there. And just even anecdotally, I noticed that I had a lot of discoloration on my skin. What doctors diagnosed as hypopigmentation. They could never figure out what it was. They gave me a battery of allergy tests to see if it was something that I was eating, maybe something in our personal care products or laundry detergent, but they never could really figure out what it was. But all I knew is that before I moved to Louisiana, I didn't have any skin or dermatology problems. And after I moved away, it cleared up. So just a little anecdotal piece of evidence that something about that environment had an impact on me. But what really got me was the fact that my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer. Not that we can, draw any clear linkages between what we may have been exposed to in her diagnosis, but just the fact that that possibility existed gave me this deep-seated interest and passion in wanting to work in communities, wanting to try to figure out what the connections were. And not only what the connections were, what could be done in a very practical way, in a very applied way to reduce some of those exposures. So that really started me, on this journey, and, a few internships later working at EPA, and then going to Emory to focus in on environmental health and studying under Dr. Howard Frumkin. I decided that doing environmental justice work was where I was called, where I was being called. And so as I entered the PhD program at Georgia State, that is kind of what I was interested in and focused on. And so just this early, experience growing up in Louisiana, and this is a facility that was less than a mile away from my childhood home. And I'll mention that while in many instances when we look at the communities who are most impacted by environmental hazards and stressors, we're talking about lower income communities. I grew up in a middle class neighborhood, and still this was our reality within a 1 mile radius. So enough about my impetus. But as I talk about those early experiences, it really led me to this idea that it wasn't my idea. It's showing up in published literature all over the place. And this is this idea that place matters. And some folks who study environmental justice cases, in their research, they talk about the fact that not only does place matter, but all places were not created equal. Some communities might be seen as communities of opportunity. Other communities might be seen for the disparities, the health disparities, the lack of amenities that exist, poor environmental quality, poor neighborhood conditions, et cetera. And increasingly, we know that when we look at and consider the social determinants of health and look at the physical environment, we know that the physical environment plays a huge role in health status, but also in quality of life as well. And as I continue kind of through the slides here, I want to connect that to Atlanta. I will also say that increasingly research is showing us that the zip code is an important indicator when we talk about health status. Some people say, and I won't maybe go this far, but we might want to look at zip code more so than genetics. And we know that there are all sorts of factors. There are the biological factors, they're the physical, the chemical, they're the social stressors. All of these things impact health and quality of life. And when we look at what is driving health disparities the most, sometimes it's hard to disentangle some of these things. But to use Atlanta as an example, and this is what I'm sharing here is from 2009, so it's a little bit dated, but I think still very interesting, that in 2009, Forbes magazine named Atlanta America's most toxic city. And so they were looking at things like our air quality ranking, the pounds of toxic chemicals that had been released, looking at the number of EPA responses in the principal city, as well as the number of facilities releasing toxic chemicals. If we bring this forward a few years, I will say just last year of interest on the west side of Atlanta, there was a new Superfund site designated. And so Superfund sites are essentially, abandoned toxic or hazardous waste facilities where there is still some present-day impact on human health and the environment. In this case, what's interesting is that this was not just one sort of, facility that used to operate, but because of dumping of soil that was contaminated with lead in a number of the homes, yards, where people live, you have this Superfund site now that has been designated not as sort of an individual industrial facility that used to operate, but people's yards are having to be dug up and tested, and in some cases trees cut down, soil being completely removed and replaced because of the activities that led to this dumping of this contamination in places where people live. So not like a facility where the pollution has migrated off-site, but in place where people live. So pretty significant that happens, in an area in the English Avenue and Vine City neighborhoods that are just a few minutes away from downtown Atlanta. So in 2012, also a little bit dated, but interesting, Atlanta was identified, or the Atlanta metropolitan area, 14 county area, was identified as having 52 environmental justice hotspots. So you'll see red and blue on the map. The red boxes with the numbers are the environmental justice hotspots. These are places or areas that are deemed to have multiple environmental stressors in terms of facilities, or maybe there's a facility that is releasing toxic chemicals, and that data is collected via the toxic release inventory, et cetera. So there's some activity going on in which pollution is being released or emitted into the environment in some way. But also you have overlapping social vulnerability. And so there was a scoring mechanism used to rank those areas that had the highest overlapping accumulation of environmental hazards and the highest accumulation of social vulnerability. And those are the hot spots. The cold spots are the boxes in blue, where there are also multiple environmental stressors, but not the same level of social vulnerability. So maybe higher income communities that might have more resources to address or to try to contend with the environmental stressors and hazards. But in this 14 county area, there's a little red circle around hotspot number 4. And so this is on the west side of Atlanta, where I do a lot of my research. And for most of my time in Atlanta, I've lived on the west side, and particularly in the Proctor Creek watershed. I actually live in a neighboring watershed now, Utoy Creek, and I'll talk about Proctor Creek in just a few minutes. But just wanted to mention that this number 4 hotspot is on the west side of Atlanta, out of the entire 14 county area. And so if we kind of drill down and look at Fulton County in particular, you'll see kind of an accumulation of different types of hazards. Hazardous waste sites, solid waste sites, sites that register on the toxic release inventory, et cetera. And here you can see, while there are some of these, environmental hazards in different parts of Fulton County, I think it's pretty clear that there is an accumulation, of these hazards and stressors in a certain part of the county. And this is largely where the city of Atlanta is. And, Fulton County has a number of jurisdictions. So it's not that North Fulton doesn't have, problems or challenges that folks, even community members have been working on. But you see this accumulation here kind of in the areas that are mostly the city of Atlanta. So when we think about the social determinants of health and the statement that I made earlier about this increasing amount of research that is showing us that the zip code, is a good indicator, of health and well-being. Life expectancy in Atlanta and other places differs based on where you live. And so there is data that comes from the National Center for Health Statistics. This was the last data for Atlanta that I've been able to find that showed some things that were pretty striking. Here, the average life expectancy in Metro Atlanta, or the highest life expectancy in the Vinings area, 87.6 years. But when you look at the Bankhead neighborhood, and the Bankhead neighborhood is a part of that circle that I showed you, that number 4 hotspot on the hotspot map, the Bankhead area, folks die at an average of 63.6 years. Can anybody do that quick math? How many years difference is that? 24-year difference in life expectancy. And we're talking about neighborhoods that are not that far away from each other, less than 10 miles away. Okay, a 24-year difference in life expectancy. So we have to ask the question, what is driving that difference? And I'm not here to say that it's all environmental, because there are a number of things that are likely contributing to this. And there is some research being conducted now to try to figure out what is, most driving, this difference. But that's pretty striking, for a metropolitan area like the Atlanta area, for a city that touts itself as being progressive. It touts itself as being the city that's too busy to hate, and it touts itself as being a city that's focused on equity. And I'm not saying that there aren't efforts that are focused on all of those things, because they are. They do exist, but this is striking, and we have to do something about this. And so in my own little way, what I've been trying to do is to work together with community residents to get a handle on some of these issues. The issues are obviously bigger than, what we can handle in any one, little research project. And some of the projects that I've been working on have been small in scale, but we've been looking at ways to try to scale them up. So now I want to talk a little bit about community engaged research. And so I'll share just a continuum. And I'll say that there's a big difference between research that is performed on populations or communities, in those populations or communities, and with those populations and communities. And I tend to try to focus on the research that is with. Very interested in things that are place-based, and there's a lot that we can do, in terms of studying place-based phenomena, that we can analyze secondary data. And so that's a part of it. But what I think really gets me excited is that opportunity to go out into the community, to work collaboratively with community residents, to listen to their concerns, and to co-develop research projects and initiatives that start with a community concern of interest, and hopefully, will lead to some sort of change, not just research, findings that we can, disseminate in journal articles, but how can we take it a step further and look at larger impact? So I won't go through this whole chart, but here are some basic comparisons between what I would call traditional academic research and community research. And so we're using kind of community research as a catch-all term right here, because there is a continuum in terms of research that maybe is in which researchers are in consultation with community members, all the way to research that is really owned and managed by communities themselves. But generally speaking, if we think about kind of traditional research, if we look at key issues around who's developing the research question, who is engaged in the research, and what is the role of experts in that research, then what is the role of community members, we can kind of see the difference. So when we think about research from a broad perspective, we think about trying to advance generalizable knowledge. This is important in community engaged research or community research as well, but also in addition to that, we're looking at something that is very applied. The betterment of the community. How can we change policy? How can we advance health equity? How can we advance things like environmental justice as a result of research? When we think about the role of the researcher, traditionally, when you have an outside objective expert who is, asking the questions and engaged in that research. When we talk about community research, we're looking at not only those trained, academic researchers or government, wherever they sit, we're looking at them as being collaborators and co-learners in the process, just as community members and community-based organizations are co-learners and collaborators. So we're talking about developing those research questions together, but starting, with problems of interest to the community. And a lot of times it looks like, a community having some concerns and trying to match up those concerns with the expertise that, a trained researcher might have, and kind of mirroring those two together. The other thing that I'll just kind of amplify is the value of the research when we're doing a lot of community research. It's not that academic publications and things like that aren't valued, but really what's most valued is that impact in the community. And when we talk about how that research is disseminated, we want to expand, what we're talking about. So yes, academic, presentations are still made at conferences, journal articles are still published, but, generally when there's community research, there are ways to try to make sure that research reaches as many people in the community as possible. So maybe there are translation activities like developing infographics or plain language summaries, of research, and developing, maybe a newsletter or other things to make sure that information can get back to the community, especially as people who had some vested interest and who were engaged perhaps in different parts of that research process. So now as I move from this slide to the next, I want to now talk about a few different types of community research. So the first one that I'll mention is community-based participatory research. This is often seen as the gold standard, where you have or you at least attempt to have an equitable partnership between researchers and communities. Communities are engaged at every, level or every stage of the research process, from developing what that question is, starting with that concern and developing that question, to even data collection, maybe data analysis and interpretation. And obviously, the type of research that lends itself to these types of partnerships is going to vary, and not every type of research will lend itself well to this methodology. But what gets me excited about research is the opportunity to pursue these types of partnerships. So another type of community research is something called community science. And there are lots of things that are characterized as community science. There's also a term, citizen science, you may have heard of before, and there are some distinctions, again, based on who is driving the research. When we talk about community science, one definition from an organization called Public Lab, which no longer exists, but they did a lot of work over the past several years to arm communities with DIY tools to help community members understand how to use low-cost materials, in some cases low-cost sensors and other things, to do environmental monitoring. And so they define community science as a collaboratively led scientific investigation, exploration, and engagement in the entirety of the scientific process. So kind of along the same lines of community-based participatory research, but really this idea that communities are involved from the beginning to the end. Then there's something called street science, which is more of a framework that joins together these local insights, what I call local community knowledge, with professional scientific techniques. And the goal of street science is to improve scientific inquiry, but also to affect environmental health policy making and decision making. So street science, and there's a book by this name by a colleague, Jason Coburn, who is both a city planner, but does a lot of, community engaged and environmental justice research in particular. And then participatory science. What is that? This is a newer term. And so I've taken EPA's definition. They came out with a guidebook on participatory science last year. And what they're talking about is that participatory science, engages the public in advancing scientific knowledge. And I'll say that there are a number of different terms that are used to define these types of activities. I do like participatory science sort of as an umbrella term that talks about the contributions that communities and the public can make in various ways, from collecting the data, again, to analyzing it, to interpreting it, to taking it to the next stage of trying to, translate that data into action. And so this is EPA's vision for participatory science. I like this. I like a few different things here that they've mentioned because my journey along trying to try out these participatory science approaches has been for some of these reasons. One, they say that participatory science can fill information gaps, provide other means of identifying potential environmental problems. When I was here at GSU, that was pretty much the thesis really for my dissertation, that community members can be involved in helping to collect critical data that will help to fill in information gaps about what they're experiencing, what they might be exposed to, and if we can look at that in a more robust way, we might come up with more innovative solutions that engage community members in those solutions as well. So there are other things here in terms of improving the public understanding of environmental issues, et cetera. All of these things come to play, but I wanted to highlight that, the piece about filling those information gaps, because that has been definitely quite a bit of my motivation and a motivation of some of the communities that I work with to engage in this work. So now I'm going to quickly, because I know I'm running out of time, just share just some snippets from a few different examples of how I've tried to use these participatory approaches in my work. So a couple of things I'll mention actually came from my dissertation work, and then I'll talk about a newer project as well. So I'll just mention here, the Proctor Creek watershed is the only major watershed that is solely located in the city of Atlanta. So it doesn't cross over into any jurisdictions as many of the other major urban watersheds do. It's a tributary to the Chattahoochee River, and here in the upper reaches of the watershed, so here's the Atlanta University Center, so that is where I'm housed at Spelman College, and the watershed starts kind of in the downtown area, really near the 5 Points MARTA station, so not that far from here, and the creek itself flows from, it starts underground, and once it emerges above ground in the English Avenue and Vine City community, it flows about 9 miles northwest until it reaches the Chattahoochee River here. It's a little washed out, but that's where the Chattahoochee River is. So Proctor Creek used to be a source of pride for West Atlanta communities, a place where kids played, people fished, people swam, and people actually used to be baptized in the creek. So there was a lot of significance, real sense of place and history and connection to this water body. In recent years, it's been one of the most impacted streams in metropolitan Atlanta. Things definitely are changing. There have been a number of cleanup efforts. There's a lot of community monitoring of the local waterway that has led to some improvements in water quality. But generally speaking, it's an area that is challenged, and if you can kind of look at these photographs and think about the environmental, what you're seeing from an environmental perspective here, and connect the dots, there's also a lot of poverty in this watershed. Just lots of challenges. When we look at the social determinants of health, you can pretty much look at everything and find some challenges in this particular watershed community. But what's been really exciting, I think, and promising is, kind of the potential for community science and participatory science approaches to change conditions in the watershed. There have been some long-term programs going on, collaborations between nonprofit organizations like the Chattahoochee Riverkeeper. It's a statewide organization, but it works a lot with community-based organizations on the ground through a program called the Neighborhood Water Watch. And so community, residents collect water samples on a weekly basis, sometimes twice a month, to look at, conditions in the community or in the creek itself, mostly around E. coli bacteria. That is significant because this watershed area is partially impacted by sewage overflows. And so understanding, what the bacteria counts are is important. As people do still interact with this water body. Every time I've gone out to collect samples there, with students or, even alone, I hear people, talk and share stories about swimming, still today, in Proctor Creek, about fishing today in Proctor Creek, despite all of its challenges. And so programs like this have been really helpful to better understand what's happening with water quality, but also to press for some changes. Because of the work of residents who have collected, water samples week in and week out, the city of Atlanta actually was made aware of some data that was alarming. And they didn't. Now, I'll say, I talk a lot about the benefits of community science and these participatory approaches, but it's not without challenge. So even as community members have been trained and there are quality assurance, quality control, procedures that are put into place to make sure that they're collecting samples the right way and all of that, a municipality like the city of Atlanta doesn't take that community-generated data as the Bible. But it caught their attention enough that they invested their own dollars and their own resources into investigating what was happening in Proctor Creek. And where community data found that there were some very unusually high hits of E. coli, next to an old sewer facility that had been decommissioned. And so we thought there would not be, this type of, these high hits, of E. coli bacteria there. When the city invested their own resources, they found that there were a number of sewer lines that were not tied off, that were not closed off, as they thought were when that decommissioning happened. And so they ended up having to invest over $100,000 in fixes, but now we're seeing water quality improved in Proctor Creek as a result of that. And so this is not necessarily policy change, but these citizens filled in an important gap in knowledge that the city didn't have at the time, and the city was then able to act on it, and the action has helped to clean up Proctor Creek. Now, there's still challenges, but just one example of how this community engaged work and these participatory approaches can lead to some improvements. I'll mention now just briefly a participatory mapping project that I did as a part of my dissertation work. And what community members were saying is that, as EPA and other federal agencies are starting to pay attention to what's happening in our community, as they're starting to invest in our community, they're making a lot of their decisions based solely on publicly available data. And so community members looked at some of that data and said, okay, this makes a lot of sense. We are impacted by X, Y, and Z, but they're missing a lot of hazards, what we call the hidden hazards, that you only kind of get, so that you only understand if you're on the ground at the community level, at the street level, if you will. And so through this, one of the projects in my dissertation, I work with community members and with students in the Department of Geosciences here who are taking a community geography class, and we co-developed a mobile application that we can utilize with our smartphones and tablets, and community members were able to go out and collect their own data and populate their own maps to show that there were some hidden hazards that they wanted to be addressed. Not only that they wanted to be addressed, but that these hazards impacted health and quality of life. So they were looking at things like illegal dumping sites, sites where there was poor stormwater infrastructure, And the data that, that the citizens gathered, that these community researchers gathered, was taken to entities like the City of Atlanta, to the Department of Watershed Management. And they've been able to make some changes in the way that they have looked at how to invest in the Proctor Creek community. In fact, a lot of that data around where the flooding happened and where the community, or where the stormwater infrastructure was not operable, or in some cases missing, has helped to influence the city's strategy on where to place green infrastructure to try to help slow down flooding and to help capture water so that people's homes aren't inundated with floodwaters and that sort of thing. So not quite policy change, but people are seeing some real improvements in quality of life in particular as a result of this work. And I won't say that it was this work alone, but this work in collaboration with some things that were adjacent to it, and we were able to connect these dots and really get the attention of the city. And now, even in some instances, the city's Department of Watershed Management is starting from a different place in their planning. They're starting with, let's go out, let's visit these sites that we think we want to develop. Let's go and visit them with the community first. Let's see what they know about these sites. Let's see what the problems and challenges are, as opposed to, coming up with the design strategies and then going to the community several stages, down the line and saying, hey, we want to do this project to improve conditions in the community. We've, brainstormed and figured out that these are our options. Now here are a set of, colored sticky dots. Just go vote on the one that you want, on your priorities, and we'll kind of take it from there. So the city is kind of starting to do their work in a different way, partially as a result of community members raising their voices through data. The last project that I'll mention is a newer project that I'm working on called Urban Heat ATL. This is a collaboration between Spelman College, Georgia Tech, and community-based organizations, as well as the City of Atlanta, to map urban heat islands across Atlanta neighborhoods. And there have been a number of studies that have talked about historically redline neighborhoods maybe being the hottest, and so we're trying this out kind of on the ground versus using satellite data here in the City of Atlanta. There have been a number of studies that have looked at this using satellite imagery and data. And so now we're kind of working to better understand the urban heat island phenomenon and how it looks, in the Atlanta area. Simply we know that, where there's dense development, temperatures are going to be higher. Where you have parks and green spaces, we should see some lower temperatures, depending on, the quality of those green resources. And obviously in places that are not as, developed, the temperatures are going to be lower. But here we're working with a low-cost sensor. And I think part of the promise of community science is that we can use, things like these low-cost sensors to try to, generate data that might help us get to some action. And so just a handheld, sensor that has an external temperature probe connected to it, and internal temperature probe on the inside, and we're using this to map neighborhoods across Atlanta. And we started this data collection in 2021, so we have over 2.5 million data points collected, and so we're at a point of trying to start to begin to analyze this data. And we are kind of connecting some dots, really talking with the City of Atlanta, trying to help inform their strategies around climate resilience. We're not the only team of folks that they're listening to, but we've been able to get them in on the ground floor of this initiative, and they've been very interested, and really they're trying to translate what it is that we're able to share with them in real time as they make decisions on where cooling centers are located, for instance, or what some long-term strategies might be to deal with the climate crisis in Atlanta. This is kind of peeled off into another study in which residents are trying to understand what local building stock looks like, and what community members are doing now to try to to beat the heat, so to speak, especially in places where there isn't central air and central heat, and there are a lot of households where that is the case. And so finally, where is all this going? I'll just mention that while we're doing a lot of projects, and there are lots of projects going on here locally and in other places across the country, the Biden-Harris administration in November of last year announced $53 million for community air monitoring projects across the country. So about 132 or so projects have been funded, including at least 2 in the metropolitan Atlanta area. And so what this says to me is that these types of approaches are increasingly, on the radar of federal agencies. And I will say that, NIH and NIEHS have, been looking at community and citizen science for a while. EPA has as well, but now they're stepping out there in a much bolder manner to invest in resources in communities. President Biden on Earth Day, or right before Earth Day this year, signed a new executive order on environmental justice. And so in collaboration with his Justice 40 initiative, it's really directing resources into communities to try to address the climate crisis. With the Justice 40 initiative, 40% of benefits from federal investments to address climate change issues should show up in communities that have been historically disadvantaged. And so with a number of the grant opportunities that are coming out, community science, participatory science is mentioned as something that folks can do. And just last week, the Biden administration marked the 1-year anniversary, of the Inflation Reduction Act. I think EPA has already invested about 40 some odd billion from funds coming from the IRA into a plethora of initiatives, not just community science and not just environmental justice related initiatives, but I will mention that EPA now has an historic amount of funding for environmental justice, more than they've ever had, and so there'll be a number of different opportunities coming forward in the coming weeks and months to try to get this money out into communities, to get it into the hands of academic institutions who are also working with communities to try to address some of these critical environmental justice issues. And so with that, I will stop. I hope I left a couple of minutes for questions. And thank you so much for listening and paying attention.
Thank you so much. Great presentation. I'm Lucy Popova. We actually have a project doing research with community, and so starting to tap into that area. But could you talk about, for people who are just starting, and like, how do you actually go to, what's the first step in getting the communities interested in talking to you and engaged?
Thank you for that question. And as I was talking to students earlier, I mentioned that I think my journey has been a little bit different because, well, at least for many of the communities in Atlanta where I'm working, I, was active in these communities before I, went to grad school, and so had some relationships already. But if that were not the case, I oftentimes, like to say it's about just investing in building some relationships, really before you have an ask. And that's challenging to do, especially in this time where there are lots of resources now that are even available to forge these community partnerships. And, not that you're, indicating necessarily that, grant opportunities is sort of driving the interest, but I've seen a lot of that where, the grant opportunities are driving that interest, or in some cases now, a lot of funding mechanisms are really encouraging or giving, points specifically for that engagement with community. So it's kind of incentivized, in those mechanisms, but, sometimes you don't have those pre-existing relationships. So to the extent that you can, if there are communities that you have interest in working in, or there are these place-based phenomena that you're interested in, trying to explore, just go out, go to community meetings, try to get a sense of what's happening, in those communities, such that you can, understand maybe who some of the leaders are, begin to develop some relationships, and try to develop those relationships before you have a concrete ask. But I think, still being transparent that, hey, I'm a researcher or, whatever it is, I'm a student, and I'm looking to make a connection. I think, that honesty and transparency, goes a long way in terms of people understanding what your motives are. But that relationship building is key. Sometimes there are these, kind of arranged marriages, so to speak, where you might have a colleague who knows, of a community group, and they can sort of, put you together, so to speak, and, it can develop that way. But I think with that, honesty, that transparency about what it is that you're trying to do, and if you have that opportunity, I would really encourage it to learn the community first, to understand some of the challenges first before you jump into let's write a grant together. Because what you'll find is that a lot of times there are concerns that the community might have that might match up with your interest and expertise, and really organically things can develop. I will say that there are also some networks like the American Geophysical Union, and this is more for environmentally focused projects perhaps. They have something called the Thriving Earth Exchange, and so they actually pair communities who are looking for researchers, with researchers who have expertise who might be able to help those communities. There's also kind of a newer group called the Anthropocene Alliance that is a network of what are called frontline community organizations across the country, and so the Anthropocene Alliance is doing the same thing. So that way, maybe it's not as weird. You have communities who say, I've got some issues, I've got some concerns that we really want to work, with some, academic researchers or others, and so, those relationships can kind of be fostered that way as well. And maybe one last thing is there's something under development. Christine is a part of it. I called you Christine. She's a part of it called the Greater Atlanta, oh gosh, I'm going to get it wrong, Science Collaboratory. So they're different, so they're folks from Georgia State, Spelman, Georgia Tech, Kennesaw State, UGA, and others. And the idea is to have people from community-based, from academic institutions who want to work and develop relationships with communities, and then you have community-based organizations who are a part of it as well. And there really has been this process over the last year and a half, almost, I guess, 2 years of just building relationships and, folks trying to understand what communities' needs are, and, community-based organizations understanding what the needs are from the academic institutions. So I think looking for those types of structures might be helpful as well. Sorry I took so long with that answer.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. Great talk. My major question, I think you kind of touched on this, is do you have any lessons learned from doing this type of research, like something that you would pass on to potentially new researchers or researchers who want to get into community-based participatory research?
I think what I would probably say, there's a lot, but maybe one of the main things that I would say is just be transparent and genuine. And I think also be open to understanding that your goals might not completely align with the community's goals. I think that's really important. For us, for those of us in academia, the currency, is your scholarship, published papers in, top tier journals, et cetera. That is not the most important thing, to community-based organizations and communities. And sometimes they're interested, in publishing and, being a part of that process. But kind of the deadlines that we tend to have in academia around tenure and promotion, and, how we get pushed and pulled to produce, on a particular time scale, just doesn't always, overlap well with, the pace of community change, or the way that communities might want to, address some of those issues. And so there can be a little bit of, bumping of heads. But if you can kind of try to understand that community perspective, and factor that into, your plans in terms of, how you need to sort of show up for your tenure and promotion, or, whatever it is that you're trying to achieve, and try to seek some balance out. I think that would be really important.
I think it's new, and I don't want to stop the conversation. But I will let those that have already planned to leave because we have something else to do. Oh, sorry, it's 1 o'clock. I looked at the clock, I can't read my watch, but I just want to thank you again. It's been a
Thank you.
delight to have you. I think you wear a lot of hats, and it's great to hear your perspective. So can we give Dr. Jelks another round of applause? Thanks again for joining here and online, and sorry if we didn't get to online questions, but I really appreciate your participation.
Thank you.